Okay, well, welcome everybody. We are starting off with a small crowd, but knowing that we're going virtual around the world like the Olympics, will be tons of viewers on Twitter and elsewhere. We press on regardless. This is the last of the 6 sessions that we're doing this summer, and this was done as an experiment with relatively short notice. So we're looking for feedback, and if people have opinions, suggestions, then they'd like to pass them on through Mary and Luz, that would be great. And let us know if there's anything you like. Let us know if there's like something that you wish had been done differently. And I can predict maybe shorter presentations would be good. And we'll look at whether we want to try to continue something like this in the regular semester and then again in the summer. So today is the last of the 6 topics that we identified at the beginning, and the topic is workflow of data analysis. So I'll go ahead and share screen and move in to that slide set. But first I'll mention that there's a Google Drive set up for sharing materials, and the slide set that I'm going to review is posted there along with a few other things. And that all got posted this morning. So if you were looking earlier, you wouldn't have found anything. I'll also mention that I posted a lot of new material for the presentation on path analysis and structural equation modeling. So let me just go ahead and go to the Google Drive and point out what's there. So here we are. Under path analysis and structural equation modeling, I put in a slide set that's been revised, and that's reflected in the date on the file. And I think it improves on some of the slides that were there before. And then also something that wasn't there earlier is there's a folder there called Data Analysis. It's got the data set that was used in the empirical examples, the program file, and an associated log file, some figures that were generated. So here's an example. That I didn't go into much detail about how a figure like that could be generated, but there's a program in Stata called SEM Builder, and I have included some files that Stata Builder creates to save the instructions for drawing those diagrams, and so they end in the STEM, STEM, Stata Structural Equation Modeling. Anyway, if all goes well, if you have these files copied to your computer and you have Stata load, well, if you just double click, it will start Stata, open Stata Builder, and load the diagram, the path diagram. So between these, you should be able to reproduce the things that are in the slide set. And I was talking with Luz and Peggy, and if someone is interested in exploring these, they will probably be available to help. And they of course don't take any of the blame for any problems or omissions or ambiguities, but to the extent that you're curious about how a part of the program works, because we didn't really review any of the program in the presentation, and it still ran almost 2 hours. It's there to be seen and potentially discussed. And so I'll just leave it at that. If you have any questions, email me or email them. And now we'll get back to the topic at hand. And here's what I posted today. I posted the slide set for today, which I'll review in a second. I also posted a syllabus for a course that's going to be offered over in urban planning. The syllabus that's posted is for a previous semester, but the course is going to be offered in urban planning in spring of 2022. And among other things, I'll hop into the, here's the syllabus itself, and I've got this at a resolution where you wouldn't be able to read it very well. But one of the main things is it's got a list of references and other things which would potentially be relevant. And one of them right at the top is a book by Scott Long, which I reference in this presentation, a book published on the topic of workflow of data analysis using Stata. And it's really an amazing resource. It might not be relevant for every person. Every person doesn't need to master everything covered in this book, but almost anybody who is looking for advice on workflow will find good information here. So I'll just mention that. Years ago, we had Scott Long here on campus, and he gave 3 days of workshops. Well, I guess it was 3 sessions spread out over 2 days. And they were very well attended. I think we had 80 people at one session, and he's just kind of a guru on this topic. I also posted some PDF extracts from Stata Help, and these are extracts which introduce you to commands that can be used to produce automated generation of tables and other things. And I mentioned the tables in part. I'll just open this up very quickly. And so what does that look like? It looks like your usual Stata help file. And the thing is that that's for the tables command. And Stata 17, the latest iteration of Stata, has a major upgrade to the tables command. And it will now do everything but take out the garbage and wash your car. If you master the capabilities of the command, it can generate pretty close to publication quality tables, either as PDFs or as Word documents or HTML files, whatever you prefer. And that can be a real time saver on projects, and I'll emphasize why that's worth knowing later. Okay, what am I doing? I'm looking at the wrong thing here. Let's try to get into the right place. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the slide set. And so just workflow of data analysis, observations, and it says examples. There's really not a ton of examples, but mainly what I mean by examples is when I make a comment about how to use a particular program, it'll often be a reference to Stata. A lot of people these days are thinking about R, and one of the attractive things about R, in addition to the fact that it's free, is that it has some good capabilities for workflow, because you can integrate the program with the production of tables and reports and so forth, and that way it can be a near seamless environment for both analysis and publication, or at least publication of certain kinds of reports. So that's worth knowing about. But we don't use R in any of our required courses, and we don't teach R in our workshops yet. Someday we may, but people are curious about it. I have a modest opinion on it, which is that it looks promising. It's open source, which makes it a little bit of the Wild West. And by Wild West, I mean open source software sometimes changes. It's like a living entity. And so you can develop dependencies on the software, and then it will change. And then you'll have to go back and adjust all your programs to the fact that it's changed. As it matures, I think that will become less of an issue. but in the past it has been an issue. And so you might be using, say, a routine for conducting multi-level modeling, and somebody improves it and the improvement is viewed as good, and then that gets implemented, and then all the old stuff doesn't work. A program like Stata has a much closer control over versions, and it's possible to go back and always reuse the old versions of the software. Anyway, so none of my examples are about R, but I know some of you may ask questions about it. Quick overview. So all I'm going to do here is try to talk about what would be involved in good professional habits and practices for managing the workflow of analysis in sociological research, and trying to make the case for why these are worth the trouble involved. And I'll note here and there some useful skills and tools that you might draw on. And let's just go straight to the punchline. You want to do this. You want to develop sound habits and practices of workflow. And, you know, the here and there, I'm kind of cheeky in some of my comments in these slides, but the short of it is it pays off in the long run. It can seem like overkill and a lot of trouble at times at the beginning, but I promise you that if you are a serious researcher, developing good habits of managing workflow will pay off immensely, not just a little bit, I mean immensely. It's going to save time and effort. It's going to save emotional distress and panic. It's going to protect you from yourself and from others that you may be working with. It also supports a high quality conformity with professional ethics, including not only replication, but also transparency of findings and some of the best principles of science. It also promotes accuracy in your work and the trustworthiness of your results. People who don't follow good workflow may inadvertently produce work that is incorrect despite their best efforts, simply because they got lost in the maze of all the decisions and practices that are involved in going from the beginning of a project to the final products it produces. People who practice good workflow are going to establish and protect having a good professional reputation. It's a sign that you take research seriously, you take yourself seriously, you take the discipline seriously. We're not putting on a play out in the barn. We're doing stuff that could be consequential, and we're approaching it in a serious, thoughtful way. And then as you get into a career, you may find that workflow may be critical for covering your basis for potential legal liabilities about delivering products as expected under a contract or under funding from a funding agency where they expect you to deliver things at the end. In some cases, you may find that the professional quality workflow may be mandatory for publishing in journals. I wish this was more widespread. It's happening, but it's not yet widespread in sociology, that workflow is mandatory for people even reviewing your work, that work submitted without workflow is treated as if it's not work. And it's certainly an extremely valuable skill in the job market, and for a lot of applied settings, this will be the most important skill that you have. It's your ability to manage large-scale projects and deliver what's expected without drama. And the last bullet point is just a piece of advice. You want to do this, you want to adopt this perspective as soon as possible and begin cultivating your skills in this area. So for this discussion here, I'm not really assuming a whole lot, and that's appropriate. There's not much in our coursework that covers workflow, and so all I'm expecting is that you've probably been exposed to the required courses in graduate methods, and if you haven't, that's fine. You'll be exposed to them soon. They teach you methods but they don't teach you projects. They don't teach you how to conduct projects. So you might go off to doing a dissertation, which of course is expected. That's going to be a large scale project. It's going to take potentially a couple of years to complete, and good habits of workflow can keep that 1 or 2 years from becoming 2 or 3 years. And it can also lead to higher quality work, more complete and sound results, and so forth. This is an introduction. It doesn't cover everything that you would need. That I mentioned that urban planning seminar that's going to be offered. You could take that if you're interested. You can certainly get a copy of the Scott Long book, and I highly recommend that, even though it's certainly probably going to have more than you ever need. It will have a lot that you do need, and just the general perspective that it creates is very desirable. So my goal in this presentation is just to create awareness, highlight certain kinds of habits and practices that are relevant. And for this, I will focus on quantitative research. Everything that's discussed here is also relevant for qualitative research, and I think in some ways the needs are probably even greater in that area. But I'm not an expert on it, and none of the sources that I'm relying on are targeting specifically qualitative research. But if we get down to it, you just ask, why would somebody listen to us instead of some random person on the internet? And it's because all of our work can be traced back to first principles. Everything is documented. Everything from data to analysis to justification for findings is grounded in workflow. Someone on the internet can look like a professional when they present slides with findings, and the distinction between them and us is almost impossible to draw based on just a review of the final product. They can look like us in terms of having credible graphs, figures, tables, conclusions, and what distinguishes us from them is the quality of how our work is grounded in workflow with replication and potential review and chasing back to see how these findings were generated. In qualitative work, that's especially difficult because many of the processes are hard to automate. And, frankly, for better or worse, it makes the work harder to sell because it often can't be replicated. And you have to put a lot of trust in the investigator. And we're in an era where trust is in short supply. It makes it harder to sell your work to a broad audience. If you're doing quantitative work, especially using secondary data, at least you can steer people to the underlying data. All of your analysis can be laid bare for others to look at. It can be transparent. They could replicate your work. If other people present similar work and they don't present the same opportunities for reviewing and considering their work, they should not be trusted. And there are plenty of people out there who are willing to offer findings, statements, conclusions that are based on slipshod work, and adopting workflow principles will give you a leg up and differentiate us from the charlatans. In broadest perspective, workflow is everything you do in a project that takes you from the original question to all of the implementation of research, design, analysis, and development of results and particular findings. Professional practices here help ensure accuracy, integrity, robustness of results and findings. It creates reproducibility and compliance with high ethical and scientific standards. Professional practices should and can avoid relying on black box findings where you can't replicate, you can't chase back. It's trust me, I'm a scientist, wink, 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 everything is great. If your results are professional practices also can avoid producing results that can't, generating results that can't be produced by others, so they're irreproducible, and it avoids damage to your professional reputation and can protect you from liability under contracts and such. So cautionary tales from the Intergalactic Truth Squad. So when I was in graduate school, I was on an informal group called the Intergalactic Truth Squad, and we tried to replicate studies here and there. And what we found is it's really dang hard. And the reason is social sciences have not historically given a lot of attention to replication. It certainly varies across subfields. So in the world of experiments, there's a lot of attention given to replication. And in other fields, almost nothing is given to replication. It's, not that people say, hey, we're just winging it. They just, for whatever reason, have not adopted that culture. And when you get right down to it, for a lot of social science, it's surprisingly, shockingly hard to replicate. There's simply not enough information available to replicate the finding in a published study, because they didn't tell you everything they did in the analysis. And there can be literally hundreds and hundreds of micro-level decisions where particular cases are dropped from the data set or they're deleted from an analysis, and there may be broad discussions of how the sample is selected and so forth. But often there's some nitty-gritty details that are left out, how particular values were handled, blah, blah, blah. And there are reasons for this that are embedded in the culture of the discipline. Some being that if you do replication work, you don't get rewarded for it, which is terrible. It's in the world where experiments are done, you usually start your own project from replicating somebody else's project.
I can hear you talking in the other room. I think you're muted right here, though.
Was I muted the whole time?
No, we just all got kicked off of the meeting.
Last couple of seconds. We just missed a couple of seconds. Yeah. I don't know what happened.
Okay. Well, let me see. Is my screen sharing?
No.
No.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Was I on this slide when we lost the connection?
Yes.
Well, there is change afoot. Some funding agencies are now mandating that they will not review proposals unless the proposals give attention to how their work could be reproduced, replicated by others. I support that entirely. Quite a few journals, not many in sociology, but across other disciplines, it's more common. Quite a few journals are now making it mandatory that to even review your paper, you must submit the data and all of the programs that are needed to reproduce the exact results that are presented in your submission. And I totally support that. Right now, it is quite likely that if you saw an article in a journal, you would not be able to reproduce the results because they are not systematically making their analysis software or their analysis programs and the data used in the analysis available. And that's clearly it's not consistent with the principles of science. It's just a circumstance that reflects the not ill intent, but just a lack of a culture, because it does put more demands on the researcher. It's in the best interest of science and helps science achieve a more cumulative path, and with it higher credibility and prestige. But it's kind of not, there aren't many incentives for the individual. It's like you're doing something for the greater good, but for any single person, cutting corners here saves you time and effort. And anyway, that's where we're going now. These trends toward greater accountability are accelerating, and there was a time when this wasn't quite so important. I'm going to pick a point in time, the 1960s. Most large-scale quantitative research was done on mainframe computers, and could only be done in university settings, and typically only by highly trained professionals in the field with outstanding credentials and reputations. What has happened since then is that there's been a great democratization with the advances in computing power, where data are now widely available and you can get access to data pretty easily. Analysis software can be used much more easily than in the past. And it's in the hands of people who can be smart enough to run the software, but not committed to the principles of science. Or maybe they are committed, but they're just not that good at it. And anyway, they can generate results that look just like any results that we would produce. And so back in the 60s, you could say, trust my report, I'm a scientist. That just doesn't fly anymore. And there's a lot of junk science analysis out there these days. It's very difficult for a layperson to tell the difference. And get down to the bottom line on this slide, there's just no argument for adopting better practices in this area to separate the high quality work from the substandard work. So my advice to you guys, broadly speaking, is, put on your lab coat. You're a scientist, dagnabbit. Just do this. Take your work seriously. Like I said, we're not putting on a neighborhood play. We're presumably doing work that we think could be important. Even if every analysis doesn't lead to major policy change or a shift in paradigms, it ought to be done well. And you never know who's going to use that work and what implications it may take on in the future. For further motivation, just think about your own work and how it's going to be received. Assume there's a skeptical audience out there. Your parents aren't reviewing your work. Reviewers are going to be less sympathetic. They're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. You have to convince them that they need to accept what you're presenting. Assume there will be potentially resistance beyond reasonable scientific skepticism. Your work may be challenging conventional wisdom, and you'll just have to be squeaky clean to force people who don't want to accept your results over what they have come to know and love. There could be, and often are, disinterested auditors who will check your work, especially if you're in applied settings and doing contract work. It's really quite normal for a portion of the research budget to be given to hiring an independent auditor who will review your work and offer commentary on whether it meets professional standards. And if you are delivering research products, under a contract for funding, you could be legally liable if the results are critically flawed in a way that's really not acceptable under conventional norms of the profession. And people might withhold your pay, for example. And this is stuff that actually happens. And in the academic setting, it's a little more indirect. If you're doing funded research, this kind of stuff could raise its head. It certainly comes up in IRB review, but it also comes up indirectly in the way that your work is evaluated when you go up for promotion and tenure review. Some things that we're going to talk about here, and some of them we'll go through pretty quickly. For aspects of workflow, there are a lot of basic issues: the clarity and detail of the documentation of how you conducted the research, the provenance of the data that you used, provenance of the results and finding, how things are backed up, archived, how they are shared and made available to others. On the provenance of data and the provenance of results, a basic question to kind of have in the back of your mind is, actually it says, could an interested party, I really mean disinterested, could a disinterested but professionally qualified party, another person, an auditor, for example, reproduce your analysis? Could they reproduce your findings? If they can't, then there's a basis for concern. There's an initial basis for wondering whether the work should be taken seriously, and certainly there'll be big questions about whether it could be the basis for changing a view about knowledge or changing a policy. There'll be a little bit of discussion here about issues of working in groups and working with confidential data. Because those are more detailed projects, I'm going to leave those for Scott Long's book, but I will mention them. So on the topic of clarity and detailed documentation, the number of tasks and decisions involved in a major project is just enormous. And getting from the start to the conclusion is going to involve a lot of professional activity. It's not really practical to implement complete documentation of every aspect, but it is in principle possible to implement enough documentation that a disinterested party with basic professional training could potentially implement your research plan. If they cannot, there's a legitimate basis for concern. How would you go about documenting the full scope of a project? Well, you probably will have a proposal. Could be your dissertation proposal, could be a grant proposal. If you don't have a proposal, you should probably draw up a document similar to it and use it as a guiding document for the project. If you're going to publish a paper, if you're going to write a book, it's going to be, and it's based on research, it would be an excellent idea it's to have a guiding document which lays out all of the basic decisions in research design. And it's easy to skip all of that. It turns out it will potentially come back and bite you at a later point. Anyway, so in many settings, like dissertation projects, funded projects, you can't escape having an outline, a proposal with an outline of basic data, sample methods, etc. But you could potentially skip that on small scale projects. I encourage you to think about setting it up as if it were a larger scale project. And of course, projects evolve, so you can have a guiding document. It could have sections with addendums showing where there were changes in research design as certain findings or bits of information became known and it made sense to change the scope and scale of the project. And then depending on the scale of the project, you may want to have project guides or notebooks with extensive logging of crucial information that shaped the evolution of the project as it was implemented. You definitely should have archives with copies of your programs. You may want to have working papers or documents that cover the details for certain methodological decisions that are justified based on actual analysis, but will not necessarily be reflected in an article or a book, but needs to be there somewhere to provide documentation of how the project results were established. When we come to original source data, we can distinguish between primary data that you collect yourself or enter and assemble on your own, and secondary data. For primary data, just start with the basic question: would a disinterested reviewer accept your claims about the data that you're using? If it's primary data, they have to really trust you. Why should they? what have you done to establish credibility? Well, if you've earned a professional credential, it helps, but there's a lot of PhDs floating around, and there's a lot of them who do bad work. So just the credential by itself is not enough. If you've got a record of publishing, that also helps. You've gone through peer review and other things that show that other people value the products of your work. In principle, consistent with the norms of science, your primary data should be available to other people on request if they wish to replicate your work. Now, you may have a proprietary interest in it because you put a lot of hard work and effort into that. So you can share it under guidelines where you would make it available and they sign some kind of an agreement where they cannot use it for any purpose beyond replication. But in principle, under the norms of science, you cannot withhold your data if people request it for legitimate scientific reasons. There could be confidentiality issues. I handle those later in the presentation. For secondary data, you are not necessarily responsible for the original data collection and so forth, but you are responsible for how you used that data, how you obtained it, and what you know about it. So you should always, if possible, obtain the data from the original distributor or through a reputable third-party distributor like ICPSR, the IPUMS project, or the NHGIS project, or yet others, Census Bureau websites, for example, other federal statistical agencies like NCHS. And not only are you responsible for documenting that you used a copy of the data where the provenance can be established, but provenance meaning, you can document where it came from, when you downloaded it, if you downloaded it, or what version of the data you received. I mean, a lot of this stuff is live and evolving nowadays. You need to document that data set so somebody else could potentially go find it. And I don't think people always are aware of this, but these secondary data sets have tons of technical reports and documentation. If you're not reading these, you need to be changing your habits. You are responsible for those data. And that means if there's information in the technical reports and documentation about the quirks and characteristics of all the procedures, you own that. If you're using these data, you can't just shuffle that off to the General Social Survey or the Census Bureau. You have to know where the bodies are buried with respect to decisions that are made. And it's no fun to read technical reports and technical documentation, but it's absolutely crucial to being a respected researcher. You need to know how these data were generated, and you have to be able to make informed decisions about using them. The existing literature will give you some clue as to whether it's
Hi, I think it happened again.
We got disconnected.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I came to campus just to try to avoid stuff like this. So I'm sharing. Okay, I'm not the host anymore, and screen sharing is disabled.
Let me help you with that.
Okay, let me know. So far, I'm still not able to share screen.
You should be able to do that now. Can you try again, please?
Yeah, host disabled. Okay. Okay, now it's working.
Okay, awesome.
Well, okay, it's working, but let's see. Did I do it, in fact? Does anybody see a slide?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Well, I'm having trouble telling if I'm, okay, now,
It's working now.
okay. So was this the slide I was on when we rebooted?
Yes.
Yeah, you were on the secondary data.
Okay, so let me skip down to the last bullet point. It's really easy when we're, especially a lot of times projects start through kind of a process where we get curious about something, we get convenience copies of data sets from colleagues, or just things that are kind of laying around in easy to access locations on the web, and maybe distributed through somebody's personal website or something, and we get into it, and then later we start getting serious. We don't have any intentions at the beginning of being more than curious, but then it turns out we're going to try to do more. You need to back up and go acquire the data from a more credible source where the provenance can be established, because you never know. Everything could be on the up and up, and everybody in good faith is posting copies of data sets. I post copies of data sets for my courses. I send them to people by email attachment. But ultimately, if you're doing a dissertation, writing a paper, you need to either chase back to the original source data and work with it, or you need to work with the person who provided you the data set, especially if it involves any kind of sampling or data extracts, creating new variables, merges, etc. You're responsible for all of the provenance of the data, and if they're if they're not your employee or somebody who's going to be legally responsible for all of that, you need to just chase back. Okay, on original source data, maintain a version history of the primary. Here we are. But with primary data typically involves a lot of cleaning, and you'd want to start with your raw data entry files, periodically archive them. You're going to be cleaning and editing them. If you can, do that with programs and whenever possible, and avoid direct data editing by hand. If you do any of that, either editing by program or by hand, maintain a history of the data sets so that there's an understanding of how changes take place between different versions of those files. And it's really not that much work, but just go ahead and do it. And in the end, you'll have a clean data set that you will claim is appropriate for using in your analysis. And there should be a history to show how that data set emerged from the original raw data entry or coding that was done with any intermediate cleaning. And this can be useful for chasing down anomalies in the final data set. Is that anomaly an actual data point that just happens to be an outlier, or was it a mistake? Was it a mistake in the cleaning process or in data entry? Again, the guiding question is, why should somebody believe that your data set can be trusted? On secondary data sets, you should have copies of the original data if that's feasible. It typically is. Even large-scale data sets, it can be feasible these days because storage costs have become really, really cheap, and even enormous data sets can be downloaded and archived. And there should be a variety of checks in your programs, we'll talk about this a little later, where your programs take the original data, reproduce sample counts, tabulations, other kinds of information that is found in the original distribution code books technical documentation, and so forth. If you have not done those kinds of checks, you're at really high risk for working with a version of the data set that's out of sync with the original source. And who's that on? That's on you. And it would, you want to avoid being in that awkward situation. Everything might be going forward in good faith with all best of intentions, but errors and anomalies can creep in. So reproducing tabulations and codebook tabulations and technical documentation analyses, those are very important checks that ought to always be done when you're working with secondary data. Now we get to our analysis data sets. And again, you're responsible for establishing the provenance of the data that you're using. And so provenance is basically just the documented history so that somebody could understand where all these data points came from, chase back to the original sources if necessary, to answer any questions they may have about how the data produce these findings. And this means you'll need documentation of case selection, the creation of new variables, recoding the variables that were distributed, any corrections in the data set, adjustments that you may make to any aspect of the data, cleaning that you implemented. Whenever possible, all of this should be done with programs where there is code that would provide an exact understanding and the possibility of replicating what was done. Whenever possible, avoid manual or direct user actions. And by direct user actions, I mean like doing things interactively or hand editing in a intermediate file or a final analysis data set. If you think about what the provenance documentation would say, it would say, I had a data set, there was an error in it, I corrected it by hand. And it's now represented in the analysis data set. You want to minimize that kind of thing. If you can, you'd like a chain of possession from the original source data to the analysis data. So that means keeping archival copies of all your intermediate files, in copies of the programs that you wrote, which reproduce sample counts and tabulations to establish the veracity of the data set. There were no, you can go to a website and download a data set. It could be a messed up version. This happens from time to time. Census Bureau recalls data sets and replace them with a better version. All this stuff is not to be taken for granted. Okay, a couple of slides here on things you need to do to take on a professional approach. Separate production work from exploratory work. Production work is where you actually produce findings and everything that leads to those findings. You produce analysis data sets. You produce new variables and measures. All of this needs to be documented. You cannot defend not documenting this. If you have a result in a paper or a presentation or a publication, and you can't say how that was generated and how it could be replicated, you've not met your professional obligation to the norms of science. There's other work that's exploratory. You're working with the data, you're kicking around, kicking the tires, so to speak. You're checking variables out, you're graphing them, you're running preliminary analysis using new procedures or even familiar procedures, and just checking things out. This work is very ephemeral. It's perfectly legitimate. It's conducted informally, and it may well be crucial to you, guiding you to the analysis you're ultimately going to do. But you can't get away with this casual, informal work for your production work. At the point when your exploratory work leads you to adopt a particular decision in your production work, then it's got to be documented. Simple. This one I think people really struggle with. In fact, I think I know, well, I haven't done an exhaustive, I haven't done a census of all student research practices, and I haven't even done a representative sample, but I have a lot of non-representative cases where students are not meeting this principle. Your production work, your professional work, and your personal computing need to be kept separate with a very bright line between them. This is not easy. It's inconvenient and it's hard, but it's really important, and you need to strive for this. You may prefer to work on a computer that you own because you have total control over it and you can take it with you wherever you go. It's all good. You don't want to work on a university computer or something else that slows you down. You don't have control over it, or it's just inconvenient. You are at high risk. You should look at your professional work as a serious investment of your time. And it is at risk if it's all being done on a computer where you're doing more personal computing activities, especially playing games, searching the web for things that are not narrowly confined to professional activity. You're at risk for viruses, you're at risk for malware, you're at risk for being hacked, you're at risk for confidential data being compromised. You're potentially legally liable for problems like that if you had confidential data under some agreement and you have placed it on a personal computer. It's just unacceptable. And for me, I think it was much easier to adopt habits in this area because I was trained at a time when a lot of this work would be done on a mainframe computer, and it was all tightly controlled. And I was just used to doing professional work in one setting, and we didn't have smartphones and personal computers where any portion of my work could have been done in that environment. So I've just maintained that habits. I always do my professional work on a computer that is dedicated to professional work only. I don't have any game software on those computers. I don't do any personal web kinds of activities, everything from, looking for cooking recipes to, who knows what. And I certainly don't do anything on my phone that winds up playing a role in shaping my research activities. And I see students doing this all the time, and sometimes even taking pride in the fact that they're able to do tricks on their phone, which become part of their workflow, transferring data, I'm just moving files around and stuff. I wouldn't say it's horrifying. I would just say, because everything's done with the best of intentions, but the provenance of the workflow is completely compromised by all of this. And it's at risk. You are at risk of losing all your work. I have seen projects go back to zero because somebody got a virus and it wiped out their hard drive. And they got the virus through their personal computing activities, not through their professional activities, because if you draw a strict line between your professional activities and your personal computing activities, you're going to be reducing your exposure to risk by orders of magnitude, because personal computing is just much more freewheeling, and it takes you into areas of computing that are aside from your professional computing, where things are much more buttoned down and risk minimized, if not risk free. And I know a lot of people won't like this advice, but I'll say spend $500, buy a used computer that you can dedicate to just doing your dissertation, and keep everything off of it that's not related to your professional activity. use a university computer, whatever. Do something. You do it on the cloud. Okay. There are a lot of slides to go, and we've been an hour here, so I'm going to start racing through things. I'm going to start hitting headlines and not covering all the points. But your digital data, it makes life easy. But there are things that you are responsible for as a researcher, which you might not know about. Okay, I see I have a line duplicated, so we need some editing here. Digital information is very particular. There are things that you would and should need to know about how information is maintained in a digital setting. And things like variable typing and how it's represented in a computer can create circumstances where things can go wrong, including things that could compromise an analysis. And so you should know things like the distinctions between integer and alphanumeric, integer variables, floating point variables, string variables, and then there are various iterations which may have different levels of precision and accuracy. Who's responsible for that ultimately? You. What if something goes wrong? Let's say a variable that is treated as an integer is saved in a type that at a certain value exceeds the storage capabilities of that data type. It will often go to a new number. Who's responsible for that? You would be. How would you know that it happened? Often you wouldn't know that it's happened until you find that you have a value you don't understand. How do I know this? Because it's happened to me. And it's not just once, but many times. And I'm reasonably well informed about a lot of these issues, in part because I was trained in an era where using computers required learning a lot of this stuff against your will. And nowadays we have to read about it and seek out the information. But there can be errors in, the data were distributed in a system file. The system file was stored to minimize the storage volume of the file. So they stored an integer variable as a byte, which has a low level of information capability. And then you manipulate that as if it were a long integer, which has more capability for representing large numbers. And then when the computation goes wrong, it reverts back to 0 or maybe a negative number or maybe a missing value with no warning. This happens, and it happens more than you might expect. Anyway, you need to know this stuff. Know about your files. Text files are dirt simple and low tech, but they're easy to understand, and they're not a bad way to store things. CSV files are a particular version of text files, they're a little bit easier to share and use across platforms. And then there's system files, and system files are used widely nowadays. And what is a system file? Like a Stata data set. That's a system file. In many ways, for analysis, it's much superior and efficient, but it comes with huge potential costs. It's hard to share across platforms and software packages. It often winds up embedding variable labels and value labels and other things in a file that's not transparent. If it wasn't shared with the program that generated the file, you're at the mercy of the system file. And for that program to work, it's going to have the raw data file, which is going to be a text file potentially. So there's a real problem there in working with system files. There can be. You should be alert to that. And then you could have the problem that you got a Stata data set generated with version 12 8 years ago, and you're trying to use it today, and that's become obsolete, and it's hard to work with it. I'm skipping over some things, but I thought I had something here. Okay, I guess we'll come back to it later. Merges are one of the most among the most important operations you'll do. A simple way to say what's on this slide. Merges always require that you have some variable that's common across the data sets that are being connected to each other. It's extremely important that you understand the digital properties of that merge variable, and that you know for certain that the property of that variable will sustain an exact merge without error. One of the simplest ways to assure that is to only merge on a character variable, a string variable, with a very high level of precision, like a 25 character string variable, or a string variable stored in a format that can take up to a very large number of characters. Because merging on string variables, or merging even on integer variables, can fail for a variety of reasons. And just to mention one, floating point variables are not represented with exact accuracy in digital settings. They're approximated. And a merge based on joining two approximated variables is treacherous and can easily, and often does, go wrong. Merging on a character variable is safer because it's much easier to represent a character or an alphanumeric variable as in an exact way in a digital setting. One implication of that concern is that anytime you do a merge, you should have a program prepared that is going to perform quality checks to assure that the merge occurred as expected. The same thing would be true for concatenations and other things. Case selection is kind of similar in that you are going to be making logical decisions within the analysis. You're going to be subsetting the data based on logical tests of some kind. You need to know how the functions, the software functions work that do the evaluation of the logical test, and make sure that you're covered and safe on all the relevant digital issues. And I'll just go back. Logical tests on floating point variables can be treacherous. The most common way that it breaks down is that somebody uses an equality as part of the selection criteria. So if you say greater than or equal to, take all cases that have a value greater than or equal to, and then some constant. That is an inexact operation on a floating point variable, because floating point variables are stored in approximate form in digital settings. Who needs to know that? Everybody needs to know that. Who's likely to know that? Not everybody, because it's not generally taught, but it is the case. There are ways to protect yourself on this, and it's just a habit and a practice. Whenever you're doing sample selection that's going to be used extensively over a set of analysis procedures, create a section of code that's very careful and methodical about applying the various logical tests, and have the results stored in a variable whose sole purpose is to establish that selection criteria have been met. And if it's an alphanumeric or at least an integer level variable of some kind, selecting on the values of that variable will be easier, because those variables are stored with in a way that makes an equality test safe. That is, you can be certain that the equality test matched the exact representation of that variable in the digital environment. I'm going to skip over some slides in the interest of time here. Let's see here. Always use professional statistical and database software, professional quality. And why am I saying this? Let's jump down to the middle data point. It says, this is a little tongue-in-cheek. I say death to Excel. Excel is ubiquitous. Programs, worksheets like Excel are ubiquitous. Google distributes them. Open source software distributes them. They are not professional grade software for creating and managing and analyzing data sets. There could be a very long list of reasons why, but I'll just mention a couple. You can't document your workflow. They're not designed for that. They don't have strong data typing. So the distinction between integer, alphanumeric, and floating point variables is not maintained in any rigorous way. If you're doing data entry in a worksheet, your display may say that the number 999 is in a cell, and that may be represented as a numeric value in one cell, and it's an alphanumeric value in another cell. You could not know that by looking at your display. This is an extremely common problem, especially when multiple people are entering data, and somebody in Excel puts a single quote mark in front of 99, and it goes in as alphanumeric automatically because of Excel's underlying protocols. The next person comes in and types in 999 without the single quote prefix. It's now treated as a floating point number. They're radically different in terms of how they would be handled in operations, especially things like case selection and so forth. I use worksheets, but I view them as being extremely dangerous. When people present me with analysis done in worksheets, I immediately resort to skeptical mode. Is there any reason not to use professional software? No. You can always do it in professional software. And the professional software exists and is used in professional software in professional circles because it meets a need. When you're conducting a project, to the maximum extent possible, break all the work up into programs. Accomplish your tasks by using programs, using professional quality software. Whenever possible, compartmentalize those programs into a sequence of single task programs that do one thing well, accomplish it as needed, and then are left alone and are stable and are not at risk for being accidentally modified. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's go to the second bullet point. Avoid omnibus programs. Why? Well, omnibus programs are in eternal states of development, and you may be editing. You may be doing search and replace. Every time you do a search and replace in an omnibus program, you put all of your prior work at risk with an inadvertent typo or ill-conceived search and replace. You can protect yourself from that by maintaining code in a sequence of separate files that can, I say a sequence, they're designed and in a thoughtful way to be run one after another with the input from one producing an output that becomes the input for the next program. This is a much more robust way to produce your analysis data sets and your results. And that way, if you make a mistake somewhere along the way, if you've done it following these practices, at least the damage will be contained to the stage of the analysis that you're at, and it doesn't put your earlier work at risk. In the ideal, you could run your complete set of findings. You could produce your complete set of findings for your paper by starting a master program that accesses the original data, implements all of the processing that creates the analysis data set, performs any additional work that sets up the actual running of a particular analysis, such as a regression equation, and then runs the regression equation and puts the results in a log file. In principle, you should be able to imagine that's being produced by a single program, and every part of it can be examined for the possibility of error, and that compilation of programs allows for reproducibility of results. As projects grow, and thinking here especially about your dissertations, they grow like Topsy. You keep accumulating materials, you write programs. It often will start off in a manageable way and then becomes the wild, wild west and totally unmanageable. You need to anticipate this, manage your project by creating a set of folders, storage environments, and storage media arrangements. Develop protocols and follow the protocols. And so that's the general idea. So what you want to do is keep it all together in some, this goes back to maintain separation between personal and professional work. Have a computer where the only thing on these drives is your professional work. Your data's, learn to create logical drives. Have a logical drive dedicated only to the work on your dissertation. Keep everything for your dissertation on that logical drive. Don't keep recipes and songs and MP3 music files and other things on that drive. That is good professional practice. It will save your ass. And as projects grow in size and complexity, the thought and care that you take in organizing it this way will benefit you immensely if you're being careful. Create folders. Use the folders to organize your work. Keep original raw data in one place so it never is touched when you're doing intermediate work to produce analysis files. Keep your analysis files separated into the different stages of production. When you finally get to generating results, have a copy of your analysis file in a location with the programs that are going to generate your results. That way, when you do edits and exploratory work and things, you don't put your other prior intermediate work at risk. Respect all your folders. Take the time that it is necessary to organize your files, put them in the right places where you can find them. You think this sounds like overkill? Wait until you've done work on a project, your dissertation. You spent years getting to the final results. They're under review at a journal. The journal takes 9 months to get back to you with a review. And the review says, we need you to revise the work and give some attention to some issues that we have identified, and then you can resubmit your work for reconsideration for publishing. Maybe a year has passed since you had touched any of those files. All the things that you could easily keep track of in real time back when you were doing it, because it was all in the front of your brain and part of your daily work, it's all lost. The only thing to protect you from being a goose looking around in a haystack is that you organized all of it. You know where to go. And we all know how analysis works. You do it, you modify it, you do it, you modify it. You've got various programs laying around all over the place with cryptic file names and things. You can't find the one that generated the analysis that is in the paper that you submitted. This happens to everyone at some point in time, and you spend lots and lots of time chasing your tail, going back just to reproduce something that you believed in at one time, and now you yourself are having a hard time replicating it. So last item, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. The time you invest in all of this organizational work will pay off immensely. Backup strategies, I'll just be short. Do it. It's important. It's incredibly important. Data are always lost. Your only protection is backup policies. Think them through, look for advice on it. Buy storage media, store it in separate places, some of it in the cloud if it's allowable, some of it on multiple computers, whatever. You will lose data. Your only protection against it is being able to recreate all your work files. If you were to have a virus or something and it wipes out everything at once, you're gone. You've got to have offsite storage. You've got to have cloud, something. Take it seriously. Create workflow documents for special tasks, because some things just can't be done in programs. At least document it with some kind of notations. If it's not at least mechanically reproducible, it could in principle be reproducible by people who are willing to invest the time. Comment liberally and carefully, not carelessly. Those comments will save you months and years down the line when you're coming back to a program and you're trying to figure out what the hell you were doing. When you're doing it at the time, it's all clear. It seems obvious. It won't be later. Trust me. Automate everything you can. That's that whole sequence of programs that we talked about before. Do everything you can to avoid doing anything that is production work, a number, a finding, doing anything of that sort that's produced manually. Suppose you did a paper and pencil calculation on a hand calculator beside your computer to get a number, which then goes in as a constant in your paper, reported as a sampling rate, a finding or something. Back up, write a program, find how that work can be automated so it can be reproduced. This will potentially mean, first of all, this will lead to more accurate, robust, careful work. It reduces errors. That's all good. But it also, I thought I had something here that speaks to this. There are ways, here it is. Learn to use things in your software. In Stata, learning to use scalars and macros will be an exercise that you'll want to do. If you're not used to programming, it can be kind of irritating and there's a bit of a learning curve. But then these things become amazingly valuable and productive. You produced a number by hand. Maybe you did a typo in your hand calculation. You can't figure out how you got that number. Well, if you automated that, it would be a little bit of extra work to generate the number in the computer code, save it as a scalar, generate the several scalars you need to do to accomplish some kind of particular calculation, but then put that in program code as a scalar calculation and then have it display on screen in a log file. Now you know where that number came from. If there was any kind of an error, a typo, something, it can be replicated, it can be verified. And this stuff will always come back to bite you because we're only human. If you do enough of this, each time you do it, you're at risk of an error. You will eventually make an error. We are humans. That's just our world. Graphs. Third bullet point here. See earlier comment on death to Excel. Okay. Even graphs and charts and figures can be automated. You may find it easier to use Excel to generate a graph, but if you go into Stata and generate the same graph, you have some advantages. Other software would also apply. But what you can do is you can replicate that graph without depending in a critical way on point and click operations, resizing operations, editing manually, and so forth. This stuff can be done in Excel, and it will certainly get the job done in the short run. And it's extremely hard to reproduce. It's hard to be consistent across separate graphs and so forth. So if you want all your graphs in your dissertation or the book that you're writing to all have the same look and feel, the same sizing and font strategies and so forth, you need to automate it. And it can be done. You can, for convenience, you can use point and click operations using Stata's graphical user interface to prepare an initial version of a graph. Learn to then go and find that Stata is generating the code which will produce that graph as a command operation, a command generated operation. Capture that code, put it in a program file, a do file. Once you get used to doing this, it's great. Now you have an example of how to produce the particular kind of graph that you want. You can complicate that graph with exceeding detail for axis formatting, font sizing, column row sizing by height and width, and on and on and on. You can't do that in Excel. It's all done by hand, and from graph to graph, you got to reproduce everything exactly by hand. It's impossible. Can't be done. But in Stata, it becomes automated, and every graph will have the same look and feel. It'll occupy the same dimensionality in image space and so forth. Do it. Learn to do it. Same thing with tables. Tables can be prepared by hand by copying information, cut and paste from a text-based log file, or from just eyeballing results and hand typing the numbers into a Word document or a worksheet. Don't do it that way. Learn to automate the production of that table by using commands in Stata, or alternatively in software like R. There's a learning curve, absolutely, but there are commands available. The value of those commands is that you can see what you're doing, check it, and reproduce it. If you're doing complex data analysis, the odds are 100 to 1. You will revise your analysis to tweak it in some way to make it better. That's all desirable. But every time you do it, you've just potentially wrecked every table in your dissertation, depending on how far back that goes. But if all your tables are generated by automated processes, that's not a big deal. If they're generated by manual processes, one will invest an enormous amount of time in it, which is a giant waste of your time. And you're exposing yourself to the high probability that there will be errors. And let's be real, you're revising this table for a presentation at a conference. You just caught something that needs to be fixed. You fixed it. You've got to hand enter this table or create this chart again in Excel the day before the meeting or whatever. That's a recipe for mistakes. Take the drama out of it by automating it. We're almost done. Thanks for hanging in there. If anybody's still there, I can't really tell. Confidential data pose special problems. Certainly in qualitative work, this is a major issue. Look for sources there. I can't steer you myself to that. It's a big problem for science to have findings from confidential data that can't be replicated. How do we know it's all done right? We can't replicate it. There are journals which won't accept that work. And I know that because the research data center that I'm connected with has people who are doing research, and they run into journals that won't publish their work because the work can't be replicated. They cannot meet their standards for publishing the programs and posting the data that would allow the reviewers to check their findings. There's no way to put lipstick on that problem. It's a pig, and you can't dress it up. It's just a bad situation, It may be unavoidable for ethical reasons or for reasons of legal concern or professional or corporate proprietary concerns. Nevertheless, it compromises the scientific process. Places like research data centers are working to develop protocols so that replication work could, at least in principle, be possible. It's in process. It's not a done deal, and it is a problem. These are things that we should think about. So it goes. Working in teams. Okay, everything I've been describing so far has really been kind of you as a one-man band, a one-person band, doing pretty much everything. When you're working with others, when you're collaborating, things get orders of magnitude more complicated for provenance of results, because you're handing things off, you're sharing things, and then working independently. You have to set up protocols, a division of labor, and avoid overlap where you may be working independently on the same thing and get to the point where somehow your data sets are not identical. And what can you do to assure that your data sets that you're analyzing are in fact identical? The only thing you can do is to have a protocol, follow the protocol, and have a provenance of history that could show that that's the case. You really want to avoid the Wild West, and the Wild West is my synonym for what often happens with all the best of intentions gone wrong. And that is, people start collaborating and it all seems simple, and then eventually it's all messy. And I have seen many projects literally fail, and I mean fail utterly. They got to a point where they could not understand where their findings came from, because they had worked at cross purposes accidentally, not by intention, and created a mess. And untangling that takes an ungodly amount of time, and often it's just faster to go back and start from the beginning. If you do your care, take your care and time to organize the work and the protocols, you can greatly minimize the chances for that bad outcome. So in sum, I'll go straight to the last bullet point. You can read the slide later. It's desirable to adopt sound habits and practices and start today. There's no reason to put it off. It's a life, career-long skill. It will make your work better, and it will make your life easier. Parting advice, some reasons why you'd want to do this. It makes sense if you're ethical and rigorous. It makes sense if you want a good reputation. It's easier than you think. It seems hard at first sometimes, but it winds up, as you form a habit, it becomes easy. And then you benefit without no longer the learning curve. And then this next to last bullet point, it makes sense even if you're lazy. If you're just wanting to protect your time and energy and your emotions, your emotional health, this is the way to do it. What seems easy in the short run, you pay the piper in the end. And in the last bullet point, it's really fun. Well, okay, that's not true. It's maybe you learn to appreciate it. I'd always rather go play disc golf or go surfing or something. It's not that fun, but it's just part of the work. And that's the end, and I'll stop sharing. Is anybody still here? I'll be darned.
Still here.
I meant to say, ask questions at any time, but so now I say it when it's all done. Cool. Any thoughts, questions? So let me maybe try to just cause trouble. On those slides where I talked about the separation of professional and personal activities, anybody want to push back on that, or anybody feel squeaky clean on that? Who can raise their hand and say they're squeaky clean? Yeah, don't raise your hand, but I'm just saying, among graduate students, I rarely meet someone who works the way I work. And it's like, it appears to be something that does not happen spontaneously. People have to be advised to do this. And the advice doesn't always take, at least not on the first presentation, in my experience. And some of it is understandable, because when you're at the beginning of a graduate career, you've only engaged in projects that are probably not very consequential, and they're probably small in scale, and they were very likely self-contained. But as a professional, you hope that your work becomes more consequential, and it's probably going to be more ambitious and complicated. And then it becomes essential that you move to a professional standard for doing that work. What you could get away with as an undergraduate, and not only get away with it, but maybe even feel clever about it, can spell professional disaster when you get into a big, large-scale, consequential project. And I've seen it happen. Some of you, I know, have heard me tell this story, but I'll tell it again. This is a story that, well, I'm selecting from a what are they called? Back in the old days, you had a jukebox. I guess now it'd be an MP3 player or something. Anyway, you select a song and play it. So I'm gonna name an experience like selecting a song, but the jukebox has a lot of entries. I could pick a lot of examples. Someone came to me. They asked me to join their dissertation committee, and they wanted to show me their work and get my help on a problem. They started showing me their work. I asked really elementary questions. I said, "Where'd you get?" They showed me I'll just make this up. A multinomial regression result, and they said, "I need some help interpreting these coefficients." I said, "Can you show me the program, the code that generated those coefficients?" They said, "No." I said, "Well, I'm not going to look at this. Why in the world would I look at this? You can't show me the code. I don't know where this came from, and we're not going to have a conversation." Well, they came back with the code, and okay, good. And so then I said, "Okay, well, show me some descriptive data on the data that are going into the multinomial procedure." They couldn't do that. "I don't have any." Well, I said, "Well, generate some code that generates descriptive data." And this kept chasing back. Finally, I said, I want to look at the dang data, because I don't believe anything that I'm seeing here." And I was right. When it was all done, and we went back to the original data, in the very first step of their project, they had a failed merge. They were analyzing data that were all messed up. They had done no check to assure that the data were correct. But Stata's dumb as a rock and was happy to run multinomial regression on bad data. And they thought they were doing the final analysis of one of their dissertation chapters. And it turned out they didn't even have an acceptable analysis data set. That's sad, sad, sad. That person had to go back and redo everything. They were really mad at me for asking them to do all those things. But in the end, they did get their dissertation done, and they got a job in a tenure track position where their research skills were part of their qualifications. And they later thanked me. They didn't send me a gold bar or anything, but they just said, I looked at you with daggers back then, but now I see that was what we had to do. And so, but anyway, that's where that professional personal dividing line, I think, becomes important. Somewhere along the way that could come back to bite you. I'll mention something. I guess this is being recorded, so it's not really off the record, but In
I
an
can stop
academic
recording.
setting,
I can stop
say
the
again?
recording anytime.
No, don't stop. I'm just
Okay.
random thought. Your work is discoverable, and discoverable is a legal term, meaning people can file open records requests. And as if you're working at a public at a state university, they can request. This is not scientific norms. This would be legal norms. I've had people request my data, and this can you wind up talking with university lawyers about how to protect the proprietary nature of your work. But that person under law is going to get those data, and they're going to maybe under some restriction. And in order to do that, the university may come in and do it if you don't oblige. And if your personal computer is involved, you may have somebody from IT from the university level coming in and taking your computer and looking at everything on it to make sure that they get what they need to get. This is not a hypothetical. I have seen this happen, and I have seen it happen to me and to others many times. And that's why I have a separate work computer. I've had my computer seized by a university compliance officer who wanted to, in response to in this case, it wasn't an open records request. It had to do with a dispute over ownership of data. And I wasn't even in the middle of the dispute, but I just accidentally, as kind of collateral damage, had my name added to the request by somebody who wanted to make sure they got everybody on the list that they needed to. And the university came and seized my computer. And then it was subjected to an audit. And this was like under the force of law, and at risk of me losing my tenure track position, my tenured position in the university. This is real stuff. And sometimes it's in the evolution from undergraduate student to graduate student to beginning professional to mature professional. You might not know that you need to draw these lines, but they're there. And I've seen at different times when I've been mentoring assistant and even more established professors, I've advised them on these issues to protect them from what could be really tricky and potentially even damaging situations. I mean, I don't want my phone to be the subject to a open records request where my phone was used to conduct interviews or something. I would buy a burner phone to use for recording audio in interviews, and then I'd put that burner phone in a file cabinet to document the provenance of the original interviews that I did. I don't do a lot of qualitative work, but I've just learned if you use your personal phone for storing all this stuff, it's convenient, but you're at super high risk for all kinds of problems. And it's really inconvenient to put your personal phone in a vault and lock it up to document the provenance of your data if somebody wants to know where your interviews came from.